anatomy review, the cardiovascular system, the peripheral vascular system. So mainly we're talking about blood vessels here. Blood vessels carry blood to and from the heart, and there are three main types that we're going to look at: arteries, veins, and capillaries. In general, arteries carry blood away from the heart, veins carry blood to the heart, and capillaries are tiny exchange vessels. So these rules apply. We're going to get into some exceptions to arteries and exceptions to veins later, but if you remember this, arteries carry blood away from the heart, veins carry blood to the heart, then the exceptions will never confuse you. Blood vessel walls. So blood vessel walls of arteries and veins are pretty much the same with a few minor differences. The same three layers exist in blood vessels. We call those tunics. A tunic is a layer. So we have the tunica intima, which is the inner layer. This is epithelial tissue, in fact, simple squamous epithelium. We call it endothelium. It's very smooth and it lines the lumen of all vessels. It is in intimate contact with blood in the lumen. The tunica media would be the smooth muscle and sheaths of elastin. They are under sympathetic nervous system control so that they can vasoconstrict and vasodilate as needed. And then the exterior, the tunica externa, or tunica adventitia as it is sometimes called, consists of collagen fibers that protect, reinforce, and anchor the vessels to surrounding tissue. And just a fast fact, if we laid end to end all the blood vessels in the human body, they would stretch approximately 62,000 miles. So lots of vessels. All right, let's take a look at vessel anatomy and do some of those comparisons. Again, same three layers exist in both arteries and veins, but there are some minor differences. So if you take a look at the diagram there, you'll probably see that the lumen is a little bit smaller on an artery, a little bit larger on a vein. You'll probably also see that the tunica media, which is the smooth muscle, is a little bit thicker in the artery than it is in the vein. And then one structural adaptation that veins have that arteries don't are valves to prevent backflow. Capillaries have only one tunica. They have the tunica intima. It's a thin layer of endothelial cells because these are exchange vessels, so they have to be very thin. And then just another comparison, this would be an actual artery and vein on a microscope slide, so you can see that just what I said, the lumen in the vein is quite a bit larger than that of the artery. The smooth muscle is quite a bit larger in the artery than it is in the vein. And then because the vein is more collapsible due to less muscle and less collagen in the muscularis, then it's going to look a little abnormal in shape in a cross-section. All right, let's talk about arteries. There are really a couple of different major types of arteries. There are elastic and conducting arteries. So these are thick-walled arteries, have a lot of elastin in all three tunics. This would be the aorta and its major branches. They're high-pressure vessels. They're, in fact, called pressure reservoirs. They expand and recoil as blood is ejected from the heart. And they are battered by high pressures. And when they weaken, which can commonly happen in the abdominal aorta, that is called an aneurysm. Next, we have muscular or distributing arteries and arterial, so they branch from those larger conducting arteries, and these are account for most of the named arteries in the body. They deliver blood to body organs. And then arterioles are arteries, but they're just smaller. They're very small arteries that lead into capillary beds. They control blood flow into the capillary beds via vasodilation and vasoconstriction. So they are the major determinants of peripheral resistance, which is important when we start talking about blood pressure. Capillaries, like I said before, are microscopic exchange vessels. They're found in all tissues except for cartilage, epithelia, the cornea, and lens of the eye. The wall is one cell layer thick, the simple squamous epithelium, one layer, and this thin membrane allows for the passageway of one single red blood cell to pass at a time. There are three kinds of capillaries. Not that important that you really know the differences, but just to mention them, continuous are the most common. We find those in skin and muscles. In fact, when we say the word capillary, that's what most people think of. There are fenestrated capillaries, like in the kidneys, they're very porous. In sinusoidal, that we would find like in the liver, they allow very large molecules to pass. Excuse me. Venules and veins. So venules are kind of like arterioles, the very small veins. They are delivering blood from the capillary bed towards the larger veins. They have thinner walls, larger lumens compared to their corresponding arteries. Blood pressure here and as well in the whole venous system is quite a bit lower than in arteries. Our venous system acts as a blood reservoir. In fact, our entire venous system can hold up to 65% of blood supply at any one time. There are some anatomical adaptations of venules and veins that ensure return of blood to the heart, because without that thick, smooth muscle wall, it's hard to push blood through these vessels. So veins have large diameter lumens that offer little resistance. That's one way that we can ensure blood get back to the heart. And also valves to prevent backflow. And these are most abundant in the veins of the limbs. And there are some other adaptations we're going to get into in one moment. Physiology of circulation. So blood flow, just by definition, is the volume of blood flowing through the entire circulation in any given period. It is equivalent to cardiac output. Blood pressure is the force per unit area exerted on the wall of a blood vessel by blood. We can measure that in millimeters of mercury. In fact, that is exactly what we do when we take a person's blood pressure with a blood pressure cuff. The pressure gradient, much like you learned about the other kinds of gradients that drive diffusion and so forth in the body, a pressure gradient is what provides the driving force to keep blood moving from higher to lower pressure areas. So blood will move from an area of high pressure to low pressure. And that makes sense because arteries are very high pressure vessels and they push blood into capillaries, and veins are very low pressure vessels, so blood is moving from high to low. We talked about this before, but just to review, systemic blood pressure, the pumping action of the heart generates blood flow, and pressure results when flow is opposed by resistance. So blood pressure is caused by resistance on the arterial walls. There are a couple factors that affect arteries close to the heart, and that would be their elasticity, so their ability to stretch, and the amount of blood that goes into them at any given time. So that will impact blood pressure directly. Systemic blood pressure will be the highest in the aorta right out of the heart, and it's going to decline throughout the whole circulatory pathway until it is zero as blood is returned back to the right atrium. So where blood is coming in through the superior and inferior vena cava, it's zero. So high to low, from arteries all the way to back to the heart. And this is just a diagram of what I was describing. So you can see the systolic pressure every time the ventricles pump against the arteries. A great pressure is produced. We can measure that. And then every time the ventricles relax, we can measure that as the diastolic pressure. And you can see pressure the highest in the aorta and the lowest in the vena cava. Blood pressure ranges from 80 to 120 millimeters of mercury. The systolic pressure will be that exerted when ventricles contract. It's about an average of 120. And diastolic will be when the ventricles relax. That'll be the lowest level of arterial pressure, about 80 in an average adult. And those are very, very average numbers. Pulse pressure will get the difference between those two numbers. So you subtract 80 from 120 and you get the pulse pressure. Capillary blood pressure ranges from about 15 to 35 millimeters of mercury, so it's pretty low, right? It's very low, and that's desirable because we don't want blood to move through too fast. It might push out too much fluid, and that does happen sometimes in homeostatic imbalances. But with low blood pressure, then the body is able to push through the capillary walls the substances and the fluids that tissue cells need in order to function normally. Venous blood pressure really changes very little throughout the cardiac cycle. There's a very small pressure gradient of about 15 millimeters of mercury. Now, some more physiological factors that aid venous return. I already mentioned that they do have smooth muscle in their wall and they have veins to prevent backflow, but really with such low pressure, it is difficult to get blood all the way back to the heart, especially when we're talking getting it from the lower body up to the heart. So we have two adaptations that help return blood to the heart through the veins. One is the respiratory pump. So the abdominal aorta is located in the thoracic cavity, and when the chest expands during breathing, it actually squeezes the thoracic aorta enough to help sort of milk and massage blood back to the heart. I'm sorry, massages the superior vena cava, not the aorta. And then the muscular pump, contraction of skeletal muscles, so in the lower legs around the calf muscles and the quadricep muscles, those veins are returning blood up towards the heart, towards the larger veins in the body, and when those muscles contract, it milks the blood toward the heart. Another reason they say exercise is so good for you cardiovascularly is because if you sit all day, you don't move, if you're sedentary, then it really does have an impact on being able to return blood back to the heart. And then vasoconstriction of veins is under sympathetic control. Again, that smooth muscle in the walls does help. And here's a picture of a skeletal muscle pump. Again, you could look at that like, say, the calf muscle, and there's a vein that passes through the muscle, so blood flow will be urged and milked superiorly towards the heart. Control of blood pressure. Blood pressure is regulated in a number of ways. It is regulated through cooperation of the heart, the blood vessels, and the kidneys, and supervised by the brain. The short-term neural and hormonal controls can counteract fluctuations in blood pressure by altering peripheral resistance. So just going from laying to sitting or from sitting to standing, our body is like right on that really quickly, so we don't really notice a difference. And if you ever stand up too fast, you can see occasionally there is a delay in getting blood pressure regulated because you might stand up and get a little dizzy. Long-term renal regulation is really more about altering blood pressure by altering blood volume, and it takes a little longer. The kidneys take care of that, and that really is responsible for our longer-term blood pressure regulation. So short-term responses that we have just from changing positions are neural and hormonal, and then long-term regulation is through the kidneys. And we're not going to talk about all the major vessels, but I want to point out this diagram with the major vessels listed. So you'll want to explore that diagram and have a pretty good concept for the major arteries and the major veins in the body. And if we zoom in on the aorta and its branches, we can talk about that exception that I was referring to earlier. Generally, we're used to seeing that arteries are colored red in the body and veins are colored blue. But if you take a look at the pulmonary arteries that deliver blood from the heart to the lungs, that's actually deoxygenated blood. So the pulmonary arteries will actually, on diagrams, show up as blue because it's deoxygenated. Kind of an exception to the color coding. And then pulmonary veins, on the other hand, are going to return blood from the lungs to the heart, so it will be oxygenated. So those are the only veins in the body that in diagrams will be colored red. And so just remember the rule that I mentioned at the beginning, that arteries carry blood away from the heart and veins carry blood to the heart, and then that little mix-up will not occur. So here is the arterial system. So in this slide, I have both the arterial and venous system together, and then I pulled out just the arterial system with the major arteries that you'll want to review on this slide. And same going down into the lower leg. And then conversely, the venous system. I have pulled out the major veins that you'll want to take a look at. And that concludes the presentation.